Let's open our Bibles to the 38th chapter of the book of Exodus. 38. Exodus chapter 38. We'll finish our study of the book of Exodus tonight. The gospel of deliverance, the historical record of God bringing His people out of Egypt and establishing them as His own special people under His covenant. The particular passage or section that we're in, these final 6 chapters, chapter 35 through 40, we pointed this out before, but I think it's the heart of the text. 25 times in those chapters alone, the words, the expression, or its equivalent, as the Lord commanded, appears. 25 times. That's an incredible concentration of a phrase in a particular section of the book, specifically having to do with the construction of the tabernacle. And again, the covenant has been renewed, redelivered, reestablished, the previous one having been destroyed by the people because of their own sinful conduct. And then God establishes it with the nation of Israel again. And here we get to the finer points, the actual building, the construction of the tabernacle. And you can imagine when these processes come into play, the whole nation is going to be abuzz with excitement. There's going to be things taking place. There's going to be excitement. I think we should read it that way, particularly by the end as we get to where we're at. The actual production of the tabernacle. Now, we begin this in chapter 36, and there is a list of 10 different items with great specificity related to the construction of the tabernacle. What it is going to consist of, how it's going to happen, and then point by point by point, we read about those specific things being implemented. We're on the 9th of those. We concluded that basically the middle point of chapter 38, we're going to begin in verse 21, but almost as a parenthetical note, when we reach verse 21 of chapter 38, we have kind of a deviation from the text that takes us back to the previous section where God requests from the people a free will offering in order to produce His tabernacle. Now, before we jump into that section together, let's bow together. Our Father in heaven, thank You for blessing us with this day. Thank You for our lives, and thank You for taking such good care of us. Thank You for delivering us, and we're thankful for this record of deliverance that helps us to appreciate Your ability to lead Your people. May we grow in our confidence and our faith because of our time together. Will You help us, please, to study Your Word with all of our hearts, all of our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's notice some financial information. So you recall the previous chapters, there was this beginning of the contribution being collected that had this public announcement for the people to stop. We have more than enough, so stop bringing us things. Now, we kind of get some of the specifics of that beginning in verse 21. This is the inventory of the tabernacle of the testimony, which was counted according to the commandment of Moses for the service of the Levites. Now, whenever we see that there's great wisdom in this, there's the implication that Moses, in the planning of this, developed a system by which there would be a careful accounting. That's interesting to me, but it's just kind of a parenthetical note. We're also reminded in verse 22 that this involved the entirety of the nation. And again, this is a subtle note, basically having to do with the family lines of its primary builders. Bezalel of Judah, Aholiab from Dan. Again, neither of those two tribes will have anything to do with the actual service of the tabernacle. But it's another reminder that the entirety of the nation is involved in this process. But beginning in verse 24, we have the enormity of the contribution. And when we just break this down, instead of breaking it down into the shekels and the talents, I'm going to try to give it to you what most people attribute these amounts to. There are 3 metals that are referenced, as we've seen. The first is gold, verse 24. If you put that in equivalencies that we're used to, that was just right over 2,000 pounds. Just over 2,000 pounds of gold. Just over, as we move on through there to the silver in verse 25, just over 7,500 pounds of silver. The bronze, verse 29, just over, well, about 5,300 pounds. Well, that's a lot of precious metal. That tells us something about the things that the people were bringing with them out of Egypt, by the way. And they wouldn't have been carrying all that on their backs. I mean, they would have had carts and all kinds of things. That's a lot of material. But they brought all of these goods, and that's just kind of to put an end on this section dealing with the freewill offering. But now let's move to chapter 39, when we see the 10th of these 10 items having to do with the garments. The holy garments, it says in verse number 1, for Aaron, as the Lord commanded Moses. And again, we break them down as they have been provided to us previous in the book. Chapter 28, we read about the ephod. And here we are in chapter 39, beginning of verse 2. Here's the ephod, as the Lord commanded. Verse number 8, we read about the breastplate, prescribed for us in chapter 28 as well. You move down to verse 22, you read about the robe of the ephod that you read about in chapter 28, verses 31 through 35. Again, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 27, in the fourth place, you read of the tunics, artistically woven. And, again, as the Lord commanded Moses. In the fifth place, you read about the holy crown, the turban, written upon it the inscription, holiness to the Lord. Now, all of these things, all of these details, carefully prescribed, carefully laid out for the people, and we see them meticulously complying with those, and we've pointed out that so many times, we don't need to pause on it again, but we always need to reflect on this. When God establishes a pattern, the expectation is that His people comply with it. Well, this leads us to verse 32. The final inspection. The final inspection. I suppose it would be more appropriate, as one author suggested I read from recently, that to think less of Moses as a builder and more as a quality control manager. I think that makes sense, particularly whenever we read what happens in this final inspection. I'd like somebody to read, please, verse number 32. Chapter 39, verse 32.
Thus all the work of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting was finished, and the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, so they did.
All right, so here again. The children of Israel did all as the Lord had commanded Moses. But notice the completion of the task. The work of the tabernacle was finished. I don't know how many times it's been in your life that you've got to the end of a very significant project. And I don't know how many times that might have been in a group dynamic. But this would have been a relatively momentous occasion. I mean, they've had several of these great moments together, but this one would be high on the list, the completion of the tabernacle. The work is finished. They bring it to Moses, verse 33, for verification. They brought the tabernacle to Moses. There's a lot of debate over how that might have happened, but remember, the tabernacle is a movable structure. Okay, so it makes sense that he might have been in a space and they brought it to him, and perhaps they brought the schematics, and who knows, but they bring it to Moses because he's the one who got the pattern. He's the one that God communicated this to. He's the one who's going to be trusted with the analysis to make sure it meets all of the criteria. Now move down to verse 42, please, because the intervening verses are merely just about the various utensils themselves. Verse 42. According to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did. So the children of Israel did all the work. That's the conclusion. It would not be an overstatement to say much of what we've read for about 6 or 8 chapters is basically summarized in that phrase. Everything that the Lord had commanded, the children of Israel did all the work. They did it. They did it. It is a profound testament to a group of people who just a few chapters before were building a golden bull so they could offer sacrifice to it. This is a huge transformation in their theological thinking. Their whole worldview has changed. It's shifted. And in the text, it picks it up and tells us the people did it. They actually did it. Now, you find yourself in a group of people that have just been punished because of a group sin that you've been involved in, and you might notice people would maybe not be so inclined to do that, which a punishing God had inflicted upon them, but they did. And they receive a commendation, verse 43. Moses looked over all the work. He looked over it. He didn't rubber stamp it. He looked over it. He looked over the work, and indeed, they had done it as the Lord had commanded. Just so they had done it. You recognize the emphasis of that? The emphasis of that idea. They did it according to the pattern that was revealed to them, and Moses blessed them. A commendation, probably in the form of a prayer of some kind. You've done well. The commendation. But the doing of good, the well-doing, is defined in the text precisely. It's doing exactly what the Lord has done. And that, my friends, that is a fitting definition of success. Doing everything the Lord has commanded. It's interesting. But all of that construction process gets us to the point where the tabernacle will be perfected. You might, with no irreverence intended, consider chapter 40 move-in day. Chapter 40 is another of those events. Chapter 40 is peculiar because among the nation of Israel, God is going to be physically dwelling, present with them in a way that is different than it has been previously. It is a momentous kind of chapter that we'll see what we can do with. Notice, if you will, with me, 7 different things from chapter 40. The first of which is the precision that's involved in the process. Here it is again. The Lord spoke to Moses. Now you notice that chapter 40 begins with a word. Then. None of this is possible if they had one less socket joint to hold up the tabernacle courtyard. If they shortcut it by one, if they shortcut the size by a certain level, if the right color fabric wasn't in the place that nobody was ever going to see, if one of those details is off, you cannot read chapter 40. Chapter 40 doesn't happen if every precise detail from God, despite the preference of the people who are involved, despite what the culture might want them to do around them, it didn't matter what anybody thought. All that mattered, here's what God wanted for his house. Here's what Israel did. Because Israel did that, then the Lord spoke to Moses and said, now it's time to do something special. Now it's time for my intention really to be accomplished. On the first day of the first month. All right, we've been at this for several months now. What's the significance of that day? It's the Passover. Abib, Nisan, March, April. It's the beginning of the Israelite year. It is the Passover celebration. There's a couple of really interesting things that we have to put in our minds. This whole elaborate building, in fact, the whole removal from Egypt, coming out with the Exodus, everything that happened at Sinai, the whole events with the golden calf, all of those events, all of those have happened before we get here. We are 1 year basically removed. They completed the whole process in less than a year. And if you go through and do the math, I mean, people kind of bicker about it a little bit, whether it's 6 months or 9 months that they were working on the construction itself. It doesn't really matter. It was less than a year. And God had it so carefully orchestrated that by the time they observed that Passover, that celebration meal of their deliverance in the wilderness for the first time, they would have this tabernacle in place. That elevates this structure in their minds and in the purpose that God had for it. He basically says, by implication, you do not celebrate my delivering you out of Egypt until you have done what I have commanded and built me this house. It's that important. You can't honor me. You can't remember it well unless you're doing it in my structure, according to my regulations, in my environment. It's a very significant day. So the timing is precise. But then the order is also very precisely given to us. If we were to go really carefully through the next several verses, through verse 8, we read of, number 1, the tabernacle, number 2, the ark, number 3, the veil, number 4, the table, number 5, the lampstand, number 6, the altar of incense, number 7, the screen of the door, number 8, the altar of burnt offering, then you have number 9, the laver, then you have number 10, the courtyard. 10 elements. You're getting that repetition again of 10, and it recurs over and over and over again, and that's not incidental. We're familiar with Hebrew culture and thinking. But these 10 items, here's the order. Now, having given us a time, and then having given an order. Now, it would be probably unwise to say that each time the tabernacle was deconstructed or constructed, it went in that order. Because as we read later following this, there's going to be whole groups of Levites working. It would seem to be in concert on different things. But in this particular incident, God said, here's the day. By the way, that's important too. Because this whole thing could be put up and taken down in a day. That is important. Because these people had to be ready to go at a moment's end. When God said it's time to go, it was time to go. This thing could be set up in a day. But the precision is number 1. Number 2 is the purification of the objects. Number 9, verse number 9. You shall take the anointing oil and anoint the tabernacle and all that is in it, including its utensils and the altar and its utensils, the things. Now I just want you to listen to these words and you kind of shout out to me what theme you hear. Hallow, holy, consecrate, holy, consecrate. All right, what's jumping into your head? What do those words mean? Shout out a word. Pure. Pure. This is for me, God says. You will treat it as such. It will be pure. It will be set apart by itself. It will be for a holy purpose. It will be for a holy intent. It is by design to be pure. So you purify the objects. And we've made this point before. It's subtle. It's worth bringing up again. Usually we think of being made holy to do with humans, with spirit beings, because spirit beings are holy or not. And we think of purity being removal of sin. Well, we're right. But notice here, holiness is much more than the removal of sin. Because these objects never had sin. There's something about consecration and purity that transcends sin. We stop really short when we say purity ends at the removal of sin. There is something much more involved. What that is, I'm not intelligent enough to argue. But these objects never had sin. They were sinless. They were inanimate. They didn't have spirits. They couldn't sin. They couldn't be tainted by sin. But they had to be consecrated. They had to be made holy. Now, the point we made with that in a previous class was you and I need to learn the lesson. It's not good enough to live without sin. That is not good enough. God has never defined holiness as absence of sin. And we can walk around, talk about how we don't do this, we don't do that, we don't sin, I don't murder, I don't steal, I don't whatever. It just doesn't matter. That's not holiness. That's one part of it. Okay. Purification of objects. Let's keep going. Number 3 is consecration of the officials. Verse 12. Then, so you got the place ready, then bring Aaron and his sons to the door of the tabernacle of meeting and wash them with water. Wash them. Again, you get that same kind of connotation, right? A purification, a consecration. In fact, the term is used. You put on him the holy garments, it says, verse 13, and consecrate him. And then you bring his sons and you clothe them. You anoint them in the same way as you anointed their father, that they may minister. Now, pay careful attention to verse 15. There are two very important points, I think. Number 1, you anoint them that they may minister to me. Okay, so we have this idea, and it's partially true, okay, that whenever a person brought a sacrifice to the temple later, or to the tabernacle in these days for sacrifice, that the service of the priest was to take it from the person, to slaughter the animal for the person, and to make a sacrifice for the person. Okay, well that's true. But that's only half the story. And God made it abundantly clear right here. These people are ministering to me. To me. God relies upon this service just as much as the people do. Okay, New Testament Christian, you just threw 1 Peter right in your face. The whole book. God relied upon the service of the priest as much as the people who came to them did. That is a phenomenal concept. That takes the concept of priesthood and it just elevates it. They're ministering to me. But the second important thing is that this shall surely be an everlasting priesthood throughout their generations. Implying something that we really haven't heard articulated, implied but not articulated, that this priesthood was going to continue. Generation after generation after generation after generation. That's significant. So we got objects purified. Then we have the officials consecrated. If you hold that remark, John, I'll come right back, okay? Number 4. The devotion of the overseer, verse 16. Thus Moses did, according to all that the Lord commanded him. So he did. Now you should notice there's a little contrast between that verse and the one we talked about a few minutes ago. In the previous verse, it was the people did all that God said. Here, Moses did it. There is an inseparable link between those two ideas. Inseparable. The devotion of the overseer, of the administrator, of the leader. That holiness, that devotion to detail and to the plans of God is critical if the people are to follow. They are connected, and they're connected here. All right? Real quickly, the completion through obedience. We start in verse 18 and we read those same 10 items that we looked at in verses 1 through 8. The exact same 10 items, the exact same order. in every case. The significance again is as the Lord commanded Moses, as the Lord commanded Moses, as the Lord commanded Moses, as the Lord commanded Moses. Now you move to verse 33 and we read this. He raised up the court all around the tabernacle. He finished it. That's number 10. And the altar out there in the courtyard. He hung up the screen. So Moses finished the work. All right, we make a really dangerous assumption here. We look at that and we see this as the end of the book of Exodus. We should see this verse as the introduction to Leviticus and Numbers. That's what this is. These are not books in isolation. In fact, somewhere around verse 34, you enter a quote that is repeated in the book of Numbers. I don't remember if it's chapter 9, chapter 10. It's somewhere in there. It's basically 48 days later. Everything you read in the book of Leviticus and up to about chapter 10 of the book of Numbers fits right there between that paragraph mark between verse 33 and verse 34. Everything. This is not the end of the book of Exodus. This is the beginning of the delivered people. Everything we read in Leviticus ties right in. Everything we read in Numbers will tie right back in. They were never authored to be independently handled. They have different purposes, to be sure. But notice Moses finished the work. All right, John, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you up, but I want to get to that point before we break. Right. So John takes it right back to Exodus 3 in this connotation of objects, inanimate objects being holy. And he takes us right back to that occasion where the Lord looks to Moses, says, remove your sandals because the place where you're standing is holy. And John's point is, well, God's presence is what made that holy, God's purpose. And that's, I believe, the element, right? Very good. Yes, Sandy. And Him only. So Sandy brings us right back to that idea, okay? The set-apart, holy devotion. Now, There's great instruction in this, right? Our thoughts, our hands, our feet, our automobiles, our stoves, our ovens, our refrigerators, everything, our stewardship of everything that we have, right? All of that takes on a really higher, when we get out of this idea that being a good person is not sinning, and we invite into our lives this idea of being consecrated to God, and everything that I have, because it's His, is consecrated to Him, and His working in my life makes it. All right, we just elevated our lives, and I believe that's the shared idea of both these comments, and I believe they're very relevant. Which is to say, the book of Exodus is a profoundly practical book. We just have to read it as such. Right? Very good. The completion. Let's drop a thumbnail here. Moses finished the work. Moses finished the work. He finished the work. Now, in my Bible, that phrase is circled. And as we noted before, the first word of verse 34 is circled, and there is a line between the two. There are some manuscripts that join them. Most English translations will take verse 33 and it will lift it up into the previous paragraph, make a break, and then you've got a new paragraph, verse 34. There is a historical thought that if there were to be a paragraph division, which there weren't really in its original forms, verse 33 would be the beginning of the paragraph, well, at least to the point where we get to Moses finished the work. Here's the point. Moses finished the work, and then, okay, if that exclamation point doesn't shout to us, then we're not reading the text right. It is a direct consequence of Moses' dedication to this act of devotion. Everything you read that follows is the direct consequence of all the meticulous details. And we read through that and we start getting bored and we say, well, didn't we read this once? Didn't we read this twice? Well, isn't this the third time we've read this? And we're like, man, this is so boring. No, it isn't. It's precisely the point. Without the meticulous detail, God said you make those particular parts of the mercy seat basically by hammering the metal. Meaning if you build a forge to do it, it's wrong. You use bronze for that. Well, bronze is kind of tacky. I want to use silver. No. God never permits that kind of latitude. Ethically, morally, religiously. He never gives human beings the ability to say, well. But what we read in this great irony, just these handful of verses, is how powerful obedience really is. Okay, there's this really unfortunate misconception of obedience that it darkens one's life. That submission deprives. That adherence to commands restricts. But what I hope we realize in these final few verses is that rather than any of that being the case, obedience brings into the lives of those who submit the greatest possible blessings. And that's the point, I think, of much of the book of Exodus. Then, it says, the glorification of the tabernacle. All of that beautiful material, all of that craftsmanship, all of that embroidered work, all of the laborious effort that went into all of the money meant nothing until this moment. the cloud. Well, we first saw this cloud in the wilderness leading them. We saw this or a similar cloud next on the Mount Sinai when Moses was engaging in those meetings with God. We saw it the third time whenever in their period of alienation from God, the cloud would hover over the small tent of meeting that Moses had put up outside the camp. All right, but now we see it in a different place. Now we see it in a very different place. The cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting. Impressive, but somewhat inconsequential, because the real punch comes in the next phrase. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. I'm going to be honest with you. If reflection on that thought doesn't start some kind of a little tingle down around your Achilles tendon and start working its way up your neck, one of two things. I'm a horrible teacher, which is probably true. Or we need to go back and reread that phrase. Would you just think about that phrase? The glory of the Lord. I don't know what that means to you. I don't even know what that means to me. But I have never seen it. Not once in my life have I ever seen it. And in fact, if I read my Bible correctly, the only time I'm ever going to see it is in heaven. But it's here. It's here. Now, insert the book of Hebrews. Because what we have in Christianity is better than that. Will we learn that lesson ever? New Testament, pure Christianity is better than that. It's better. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, the force of which was such that Moses was not able to enter the tabernacle of meeting because the cloud rested above it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. That is a force. That is an energy. Now certainly true. It's His residence. It's His. And we also know that there will be kind of changes to this. This is a temporary thing because both he and Aaron will later enter the tabernacle. And of course the high priest went in there once a year. So we know there was some latitude here in the plan of God. But particularly on this occasion, that glory was... Moses has been absorbed in this glory at least twice, if my memory is right. But now this is so different that he can't even go in. He's been immersed in this cloud before. But the cloud was there, but this glory wasn't. You see, this is different. This is different. This is probably why that reference in the book of Hebrews about this being God's way of teaching us something about what heaven is, that's probably one of the primary components of that. The glory of the Lord. I've never seen it, neither have you, but it's here. And that's true because the owner has taken residence. The owner has moved in. And that is phenomenal, particularly as we think about the progression of these people. Now, the more familiar part of this is the direction that this provides. As we read through the final verses, verse 36, whenever the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle, the children of Israel would go onward in all of their journeys. In other words, their movements would be secondary to this observation. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not journey till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was above the tabernacle. And I'm going to stop there for just a minute. But we get the idea because we're relatively familiar with this. In fact, they had been introduced to it previously. When the cloud moves, we move. So when God moves, we move. When does God move? He doesn't. He has set his standard at the cross of Calvary. He doesn't move, will we? The direction, secondary to observation. Now notice, the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle, verse 38. Let's get the impression here. By day, when they were awake. By night, when they were asleep. In the sight of all the people, when they were alert. And throughout all their journeys, when they were afoot. And I hope there's a passage in the book of Deuteronomy about teaching your children that somewhat is ringing familiar in your ears right now. The whole point is the presence of God in that tabernacle was there. And it will be for the rest of their journeys until the consequences that we all know happen later in the Old Testament theology, the Old Testament account, until he leaves it. That presence of God among his people is the reason he brought them out of Egypt in the first place. And it was his way of making sure that you and I ultimately get to go to heaven. That makes the book of Exodus a thrilling document. And what has been for me one of the richest studies that I've ever personally engaged in. And I'm grateful for it. With that, we conclude. Final comments, questions, thoughts? Okay, so what do you think? Dennis took us to 2 Corinthians 3. What's your tie-in? Very good. Jesus, he set his standard at the cross, right? In the form of Jesus. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. Now, obviously, he was talking to people who had the privilege of face-to-face, but I believe, Dennis, that would be my exact thought too. The difference, as we get into that Corinthian description in this one, is our Lord. It is a layering of glory that is manifold, right? The manifold wisdom of God from Ephesians. So I think you're on the right track. I would agree. Others? True.
And when I read these lists of names, no matter how hard they are to pronounce or how difficult they are to understand and read them, God wrote those names in a book and is writing our names in a book. And how can that be boring?
good. Fall in love with the Bible. It's the only place you will learn to fall in love with God. And if we don't fall in love with God, as Sandy just suggested, He will not fall in love with us to the degree that He writes our name in His book. Thank you all very much.